When white opens the game with d4, and black responds with d5, both sides taking a fair share of the center, white's most direct and challenging response is c4. Turning the game into the queen's gambit, white's positional threat is to remove black's central pawn with c takes d5. In response to this threat, unless black wants to learn the ins and outs of the queen's gambit accepted with d takes c4, then black should support the central d5 pawn with another pawn, either with e6, turning the game into the queen's gambit declined, or else turn the game into the Slav or semi-Slav defense with c6. In today's video, we are going to concentrate on the solid Slav defense. The move c6 prepares to respond to c takes d5 with c takes d5, maintaining a healthy pawn center. The move c6 allows the light-squared bishop to enter the action on its most natural diagonal, often with bishop f5 and sometimes bishop g4. The drawback to this solid move is it blocks the knight on b8 from accessing its most natural square. When you see the Slav defense from white's perspective, you may feel a bit uneasy that black may take your pawn with d takes c4 and hold the pawn with b5. This is definitely an important theme to keep in mind, but white can currently ignore this point and play knight f3. White continues to develop, not fearing the possibility of black playing d takes c4. It turns out that black cannot hold on to this extra pawn without making some serious concessions. The move d takes c4 reveals black's queen's pressure against the d4 pawn, so a solid response is to support this pawn with e3, defending d4 and preparing to play bishop takes c4. If black tries to hold on to the pawn with b5, it does look like black is securing the extra pawn, but it's important to remember the instructive counterstrike, a4, attacking the b5 pawn. The point of this move is revealed after black plays a natural move such as knight f6. As well as against most other moves, white will respond with a takes b5, c takes b5. Now that the pawn on b5 is unprotected, white can play b3. White is ready to regain the pawn with b takes c4, creating a strong position, and if black plays c takes b3, white can simply play bishop takes b5, with check, followed by collecting the pawn on b3. Since black cannot comfortably hold on to this pawn, white enjoys an excellent position. Another attempt to hold on to the pawn is bishop e6. One promising idea for white is to play knight c3, preparing to take over the center with e4, which often works well with the disruptive knight g5, attacking the light-squared bishop. Instead of playing knight c3, another idea is to play a4, adding some control against the b5 square, and preparing to play knight a3, when white will regain the pawn with knight takes c4, once again enjoying an excellent position. Instead of trying to capture the c-pawn, black's most solid continuation is knight f6. Developing a piece and supporting the center, white has a variety of moves at this point, but the main line is knight c3, sensibly developing and adding more pressure against black's d5 pawn. At this point, black has an important choice to make. Black can reinforce the d5 pawn with e6, turning the game into the semi-Slav defense. Before playing e6, if black would prefer to develop the light-squared bishop, often moving to f5, black can turn the game into the Slav defense by playing d takes c4. Instead of playing d takes c4, entering the main lines of the Slav, you may wonder why black can't simply play bishop f5. Of course, this is exactly what black wants to achieve, but white has the powerful response c takes d5. After c takes d5, white increases the pressure against black's position with queen b3, eyeing both the b7 and d5 pawns. Trying to defend the pawn with b6 weakens light squares on black's queen side, which is especially a problem with black's king stuck in the center. If black tries to defend the b7 and d5 pawns with queen d7, notice that white can simply play knight e5, gaining a tempo against the queen, when black will be unable to defend both weaknesses. Finally, if black decides to challenge white's queen with queen b6, white can win a pawn with knight takes d5. The point is, if black plays queen takes b3, rather than rushing to recapture the queen, white has the nice in-between capture, knight takes f6 check. White is ready to play a takes b3, when white is simply up a pawn. Since playing bishop f5 immediately lands black into trouble, this explains why black plays d takes c4. By capturing the c4 pawn, Black removes pressure against the center and prevents a quick queen b3. Not only does this capture prepare bishop f5, since Black is better developed than the previous example when capturing on c4, Black is actually threatening to hold on to the pawn with b5. White can decide to play the speculative gambit e4, allowing Black to play b5. But White's most popular and reliable option is to prevent b5 by playing a4. This discourages b5, at the expense of weakening the b3 and b4 squares. The b4 square is a key weakness for Black, often placing a bishop and sometimes a knight on that square. One drawback to d takes c4 is that Black has surrendered some space in the center, so White often tries to achieve a strong two-pawn center with e4. With this in mind, Black's most popular response is bishop f5, actively developing the bishop and slowing down White's ambitions of playing a quick e4. White has an important decision to make. Knight e5 is the most ambitious choice, which we'll soon examine, but the other main option is to play the solid e3. At the expense of restricting White's dark-squared bishop, White supports the center and prepares to regain the pawn with bishop takes c4. Now that the light-squared bishop has entered the action, Black is ready to play e6, supporting the center and preparing to complete kingside development. After White plays bishop takes c4, Black's most active continuation is bishop b4, pinning the knight, a key defender of the center, so White can sensibly move the king to safety and unpin the knight with castling. Black has two popular moves at this point, knight bd7 or castling the king. Although there can be some differences between these moves, they most often transpose into one another, so we'll focus on castling. White's main continuation is queen e2, centralizing the queen and preparing e4. Instead of trying to prevent e4, which is usually unsuccessful, Black continues to develop with knight b to d7. White is now ready to take space in the center with e4, when Black's most popular response is bishop g6. White enjoys more space, but Black's pieces apply pressure against White's center, especially as bishop takes c3, threatening to win the pawn on e4 is in the air. In response to this threat, White sometimes plays e5, taking space and gaining a tempo against Black's knight. One drawback to playing e5 is that it allows knight d5, taking advantage of the space left behind and blockading White's backward d4 pawn. Another option is to reinforce the center with bishop d3, supporting the e4 pawn and also anticipating that the light-squared bishop will prove quite active on this diagonal. Since Black does not want to allow White to simply sit on this space advantage and comfortably develop, Black's most popular response is bishop h5, pinning the knight to the queen, reducing White's control in the center. This pin prepares the thematic pawn break e5, striking against White's center. In order to prevent this idea and add pressure against the king side, White marches forward with e5, gaining a tempo against the knight and clearing the b1 to h7 diagonal for White's light-squared bishop. Now that the d5 square is no longer protected by the pawn, Black can centralize the knight with knight d5, adding pressure against the knight on c3. White can decide to avoid the exchange of knights with knight e4, but not only can Black respond with bishop e7, solidly protecting the king side, this also allows the option of playing another thematic pawn break in the Slav, c5, attacking White's center with a solid position for Black. In order to prevent this annoying pawn break, White typically plays knight takes d5, fixing the central pawn structure with c takes d5. The pin against White's knight is quite annoying, so White usually solves this by playing queen e3. By unpinning the knight, White can consider playing the active knight g5, adding pressure against Black's king side, especially the h7 square. One idea for Black is to play rook e8, preparing the defensive resource knight f8 if necessary. But since Black's bishop is currently staring into space from b4, it can be put to use by playing bishop e7. If White plays knight g5, Black is ready to play bishop takes g5, followed by challenging White's light-squared bishop with bishop g6. In addition to knight g5, White can also consider bishop d2, continuing to develop, connecting the rooks on the back rank, and supporting queenside expansion. Now that the center is stabilized for the time being, both players have flexibility with how they want to maneuver their pieces. It may be surprising, but a popular positional choice is to regroup the knight with knight b8. Intending to play knight c6, adding pressure against the d4 pawn, as well as eyeing the newly vacated b4 square. In the meantime, white can consider grabbing space on the queen side with a5, or play the move knight e1, preparing a kingside expansion with f4, and notice this knight can move to c2, supporting the d4 pawn, as well as the queen side if necessary. White enjoys more space with active pieces, but black's position remains solid, with plenty of play for both sides. Instead of playing queen e2, white sometimes decides to harass the light-squared bishop with knight h4. In response to knight h4, black can play bishop g4, attacking the queen and trying to provoke the weakening f3. But it's also worth noting that black can simply ignore white's plan and play knight b to d7. The point is, if white plays knight takes f5, e takes f5, white has gained the bishop pair and doubled black's pawns on the f-file, which at first glance doesn't look too promising for black. That being said, the pawn on f5 turns out to be very useful. It secures the important e4 square, as well as opening up space on the e-file for black's major pieces to enjoy. It's also worth noting that this pawn helps protect the b1 to h7 diagonal, making it more challenging for white to build a kingside attack. Instead of capturing the bishop, an interesting idea is to play f3, preparing to take space in the center with e4. We can now see how positionally subtle the Slav can be with the move bishop g6. White can of course play knight takes g6, gaining a bishop pair, although black can claim a better pawn structure than white after h takes g6. Bishop g6 is a subtle move, anticipating the possibility of white expanding in the center with e4. By playing bishop g6, e4 does not gain a tempo against the light-squared bishop, allowing black to counterstrike in the center with the thematic e5. When black enjoys a reasonable position, challenging white's sensitive d4 pawn. After black plays bishop f5, instead of the solid and straightforward e3, white can decide to move the knight on f3 for a second time. Knight h4 is a possibility, but once again, black can play e6, using the same idea we just explored, with a solid position. A far more challenging line is knight e5. Activating the knight on this central post opens up the possibility to regain the pawn with knight takes c4. It may appear that the game will develop slowly, but if black plays the natural continuation e6, by moving the knight to e5, white is able to play the dynamic f3, preparing to expand in the center with e4. So after the sensible continuation bishop b4, developing the dark-squared bishop and pinning the knight, white is able to take over the center with e4. If black responds passively, then white's central dominance will be a serious problem. By entering this line, black has to be ready to play sharp, dynamic chess, sacrificing a piece for 3 pawns with bishop takes e4, f takes e4, and knight takes e4, piling up pressure against the pinned knight on c3. Notice the d4 pawn is also under pressure from black's queen. If you love complicated positions and dynamic material imbalances, then this may be a line worth exploring, starting with white's most popular response, bishop d2. If you're interested in the Slav defense based upon its solid positional foundation, then rather than inviting the complications after e6, a more solid, reliable alternative is to challenge the knight immediately with knight b to d7. With knight takes e5 in the air, white does not have time to play f3 and e4. So white typically regains the pawn with knight takes c4. Once again, if black plays slowly, then white may prepare to expand in the center with f3 and e4. Since black is at a space disadvantage, one idea is to play knight b6, offering a trade of knights, with a5 likely to follow, controlling the weakened b4 square, as well as cementing the pawn on a4. In addition to this solid option, since white is planning to expand in the center if allowed, black can play in a more direct fashion with the popular queen c7, preparing the important pawn break e5, fighting for the initiative, and not allowing white enough time to play f3 and e4. In order to counter black's idea, white usually responds with g3. This move prepares to fianchetto the light-squared bishop, as well as prepare a timely bishop f4. After black strikes in the center with e5, we see the common captures d takes e5, knight takes e5, and bishop f4, pinning black's knight to the queen. In response to bishop f4, black can reinforce the pinned piece with knight f to d7. White typically continues with bishop g2. Black is faced with an interesting choice. If you're in the mood to create chaos, then the dynamic pawn sacrifice g5 is worth exploring. If you'd prefer to play more solidly, then black can first reinforce the knight with f6. White continues with straightforward development by castling. Black has tried a variety of moves at this point, including knight c5, preparing rook d8, attacking the queen, and planning to unpin the knight with knight e6, attacking the bishop on f4. The disruptive g5 is also a serious option to consider. If black isn't afraid of inviting an attack against the king, then queenside castling can be explored. In some cases, black's king can move to f7 if necessary, and when appropriate, black can also consider playing bishop e7 and castling kingside. White, on the other hand, is well positioned to grab space on the queen side with a5, hoping to play a6 and clear lines on the long diagonal for white's fiend-shadowed bishop. In response to a5, black will often play a6, preventing white's a-pawn from advancing at the expense of weakening the b6 square. In this typical Slav position, white can feel good about achieving easy development with active pieces, but black's resilient position isn't easy to break down, so both sides can expect an interesting game to develop. If white would prefer to avoid the main lines after knight c3, a solid alternative is e3. White's idea is to stabilize the center, discouraging black from playing d takes c4, as white can simply play bishop takes c4. In the e3 systems against the Slav, white is often seeking to trade the knight on f3 for black's light-squared bishop. For example, if black plays bishop g4, white can consider playing queen b3, attacking b7, when black can respond with queen b6, provoking interesting tension in the position. A more direct way to challenge black is to question the bishop immediately with h3, inviting black to surrender the bishop pair with bishop takes f3, and after bishop h5, white will chase the bishop down with g4, bishop g6, and knight e5. White is ready to gain the bishop pair with a timely knight takes g6. Black is not without chances as well, especially as white is committed to pushing pawns on the king side so early, so black's compact structure can prove quite resilient. Bishop g4 is a respectable option for black, and unless black wants to turn the game into a semi-Slav with e6, or explore sidelines in the Slav with a6 or g6, then the most popular choice is the familiar bishop f5. When you play bishop f5, you always want to make sure that c takes d5, followed by a quick queen b3 doesn't win material for white. Since white does not have a knight on c3, adding pressure against d5, queen b3 allows black to play queen b6 or queen c7 when white is unable to win a pawn. This means that in this variation, black is not obligated to play d takes c4 before developing the bishop on f5. A common plan for white is to play knight c3, adding pressure against the d5 pawn, as well as controlling the e4 square. So after black's natural response e6, reinforcing the d5 pawn, white can go after the bishop pair with knight h4. In the mainline Slav after black has played d takes c4, we discussed a similar position when black invited white to play knight takes f5, preparing to play e takes f5. With the pawn still on d5, black should not invite this exchange by playing a natural developing move such as bishop d6. Because after knight takes f5, removing an important defender of the d5 pawn with e takes f5, white is able to play c takes d5. When queen b3 is an unpleasant threat, attacking b7 and d5 at the same time. Since it's no longer a good idea to allow knight takes f5, black has explored several moves with the light-squared bishop, including bishop g6, bishop g4, as well as the interesting bishop e4. Black is willing to give up the bishop pair, but only after provoking a weakness with f3. If white plays knight takes e4, after d takes e4, white's wayward knight is about to get trapped after g5, so white needs to prepare an escape route with a move such as g3. When black can play the active bishop b4 check, bishop d2, allowing black to trade bishops with bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, and castle the king to safety. Black does not have any serious problems out of the opening and will prepare to strike in the center with c5, enjoying an excellent position. Since knight takes e4 is not a favorable option, white agrees to weakening the king side in order to chase down the bishop with f3, forcing the retreat bishop g6. Although it's possible to take on g6 immediately, there's no rush to do so. A popular option is to add pressure against black's queenside with queen b3. Once again, we see a typical theme in the Slav for white, attacking the unprotected b7 pawn, a consequence of black actively developing the light-squared bishop on the king side. Sometimes black responds with queen b6, although white doesn't mind a queen exchange, as white's king may prove slightly exposed. The most popular response is avoiding a queen trade with queen c7, protecting the b7 pawn as well as eyeing the pawn on h2. This could become relevant if white plays knight takes g6, opening up the h-file for black's rook. A flexible continuation for white is bishop d2. This allows white to play rook c1, or possibly castle queenside depending on white's ambitions. Black typically develops the dark-squared bishop with bishop e7. The bishop avoids moving to d6, where it may be attacked by a later c5, or possible e4 and e5 if allowed. The bishop also aligns with the unprotected knight on h4. White has no shortage of interesting options, including castling queenside, resolving the tension in the center with c takes d5, or as former World Championship challenger Sergei Karyakin played, g3. Reinforcing the knight on h4 and also blocking the queen's pressure against the h2 square. His opponent, Grandmaster Anish Giri, continued to develop sensibly with knight b to d7. Black remains flexible, waiting to see how white will respond. In the game, white decided to activate the queenside rook with rook c1, aligning with black's queen, preparing to open up the c-file with c takes d5. In order to avoid unpleasant tactics that may appear after c takes d5, Giri immediately played d takes c4, removing pressure against the center and also opening up the d5 square for a black knight to use in the future. After bishop takes c4, both sides castled their kings. When Grandmaster Giri played the instructive pawn break typical in the Slav, e5, placing immediate pressure against white's center. White took a moment to gain the bishop pair with knight takes g6, h takes g6. Now that black is castled, opening up the h-file with this capture does not help activate a black rook. White has gained the bishop pair and enjoys reasonably active pieces in exchange for weakening the king side with several pawn moves. Black, on the other hand, is prepared to saddle white with an isolated queen's pawn with e takes d4, with the idea of playing knight b6, gaining a tempo against the light-squared bishop, followed by blockading the isolated pawn on d4 with knight b to d5. White is willing to allow an isolated queen's pawn as this helps open up the bishop pair and allows active piece play. Both sides have interesting chances to explore, and in this particular game, white was able to bring home the full point. Another important idea for us to explore is playing knight c3 on the third move. After the natural response knight f6, white can of course play knight f3 or c takes d5, transposing into other variations, but another option is to play e3. We reach a similar e3 system that we just looked at with the knight on f3, but by developing the c3 knight first, more pressure is applied against d5. This means if black plays an early bishop f5, then the typical c takes d5, followed by a quick queen b3, attacking the b7 pawn has to be kept in mind. In response to this possibility, black sometimes refrains from developing the light-squared bishop and plays a move such as g6, turning the game into the Schlechter variation with the idea of fianchettoing the dark-squared bishop and castling kingside. Another interesting pawn move is a6, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop, with the point that if white plays an early queen b3, black is ready to play b5. Both of these solid pawn moves are worth exploring, but it's worth noting that even though this move order seems to discourage the desirable bishop f5, if black is willing to play an interesting gambit, then bishop f5 can be played immediately. The point is, after c takes d5, c takes d5, and queen b3, we see the familiar situation where white attacks d5 and b7 at the same time. Compared to the main lines with knight f3, by playing e3, white is less well developed, especially blocking the dark-squared bishop inside of the pawn chain. This means that black can rapidly develop with the active knight c6. Black is able to gain active play at the expense of sacrificing the b7 pawn with queen takes b7. White captures a pawn and is threatening the knight on c6, so after bishop d7, protecting the c6 knight, Black is ready to play rook b8, activating the queenside and gaining a lead in development in exchange for the pawn. This is a very complicated line, and the interested viewer is encouraged to dig beneath the surface and explore this dynamic position. We've explored quite a few interesting possibilities in the Slav, but we must also consider white's option to play the exchange variation with c takes d5, resolving the central tension and creating a symmetrical structure with c takes d5. On the surface, this looks like a fairly unambitious choice, leading to the mistaken understanding that this is a boring opening in which white is only playing for a draw. It is true that some players choose this variation, attempting to draw the game, especially against higher-rated players, but exchanging a single pair of pawns is not enough to ensure the half point. There is still a game of chess left to be played. The exchange Slav should not be underestimated, as it can be played without peaceful intentions in mind. White can build a solid, relatively risk-free position, hoping to use the first move advantage to gradually apply pressure against the opponent. As long as black doesn't lash out and play overly aggressive moves to try and force the action, then black should also expect reasonable chances in this symmetrical structure. After the common moves knight c3, knight c6, centralizing the knights, white can continue to simply develop with knight f3, or else prefer to develop the dark-squared bishop with bishop f4. By not developing the knight on g1, white enjoys greater flexibility. If you are willing to accept some risk in order to create an immediate imbalance, then the pawn sacrifice e5 is an interesting option to consider. Black's idea is that once white plays d takes e5, black will take advantage of the space left behind with d4, grabbing space and attacking the knight on c3. If you'd prefer to play more solidly, then the straightforward and reliable option is knight f6. White can decide to play knight f3, when black can respond with bishop f5, or first play a6, an idea we'll explore in a moment. Developing the knight to f3 immediately tends to lead to simpler, rather balanced play, but it should not be underestimated, as Grandmaster Wesley So defeated world champion Magnus Carlsen in this line. If white wants to continue to play flexibly, then a sensible choice is e3. This flexible choice is designed to discourage black from developing the light-squared bishop, either with bishop g4 or bishop f5. White's idea is to try to take advantage of black's move order with queen b3. Black doesn't really have a convenient way to respond to this threat, and after the common response knight a5, attacking the queen and protecting the b7 pawn, white can play queen a4 check. In response to this move, self-pinning the knight with knight c6 doesn't exactly feel like an attractive option, and after bishop d7, white's queen maneuver concludes with the pleasant queen c2. White's queen controls the b1 to h7 diagonal, making black's bishop on d7 feel a bit awkward, as it's unable to find an active post. Since black does not have any compelling alternatives, black prepares to complete development with e6, shutting the light-squared bishop inside of the pawn chain, so this piece will not be as active as black would like. White enjoys a comfortable game with freer development, but black still has a solid, if not somewhat passive position. Instead of playing bishop f5 immediately, an interesting option is to play a6. This is a common resource for black in many of the exchange variation lines, preparing to activate the light-squared bishop. If white plays knight f3, then black will pin the knight with bishop g4. And if white decides to play bishop d3, developing the bishop and preventing bishop f5, then black can play the active bishop g4. We can now see the point behind a6. If white plays queen b3, black can play knight a5. With the point that a6 allows black to meet queen a4 check with b5. Black wasn't forced to undevelop the light-squared bishop, so white's opening has not been a success. Once again, we must remember not to assume white is simply playing for a draw or is content with a lifeless position. Grandmaster attention has gravitated toward the simple-looking but poisonous move bishop e2. This modest development of the light-squared bishop prevents bishop g4, so if black wants to activate this piece, then a natural continuation is bishop f5. As we mentioned, the exchange Slav is not without bite, and here white can play g4. Gaining a tempo against the bishop, grabbing space, and trying to build an initiative on the king side. Multiple Grandmaster games have continued with bishop e4, provoking white to play f3, restricting white's piece mobility and weakening some dark squares before retreating the bishop. The kingside pawn storm intensifies with h4. Threatening to trap the bishop with h5. Black would like to play h5, but the d5 pawn is still sensitive to attack, so g5 would be an unpleasant move to face. Black can discourage g5 by playing h6, slowing down White's kingside ambitions with a reasonably solid position. This isn't the typical Slav exchange position we might expect, and the interested viewer is encouraged to explore these interesting, double-edged positions. The Slav defense is one of Black's most solid responses against the Queen's Gambit. White does enjoy a space advantage with several ways to challenge Black's defenses, but with proper play, the Slav rises to the occasion to create resilient positions with plenty of counter chances, allowing both positional maneuvering and tactical fireworks depending on the mood of both players. Thanks for exploring the Slav defense, and best of luck if you find yourself playing either side of this rich opening.